to another Let's Talk episode of Tech in the Arts, the podcast series on the Arts Management and Technology Laboratory. The goal of our Let's Talk series is to exchange ideas, bring awareness, and stay on top of the trends. My name is Natalie Larsen. I'm the staff writer and lead researcher for AMT Lab, and today we're diving into the second half of my conversation with arts advocate Jeff Poulin. In part 2, we'll be discussing the intersection of the arts with other issues and the importance of arts advocacy in the digital age. I want to pivot a little bit. We've talked a lot about the positive impact of the arts that they can have on an individual, a community, but as we mentioned earlier, not everyone has that access. So DEAI topics are huge in the arts right now, of course, in arts organizations especially. So how do those intersect?
Well, they intersect a tremendous amount. I think, first, when we go back to the concept that advocacy is a muscle, advocating for diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, or I might just call it justice, is an advocacy effort. So the same skill that we're talking about in advocating for, say, arts funding can be applied within our own organizations, our own communities, with issues of social justice, that we're able to actually employ that case-making ability. Instead of it just being for the arts, we're actually talking about justice-oriented arts or equitable access to the arts or the fight for greater diversity and inclusion within the arts or even through the arts. And that's a really important distinction. In a lot of my work today, we talk about the intersection of justice with advocacy. So not only are we advocating for the arts, we're also advocating for issues of justice, and we're also using the arts to advocate for those issues of justice. So we're able to create kind of this beautiful tapestry with the skills that we have as artists and creatives and as advocates towards this North Star. I think we can all get on board that we want a more just world. In fact, that's actually the, mission statement of the organization that I run now, is that our end goal is a more just world. And that's because that's what people strive for. Now, how we get there might be different. Maybe some people believe that it's public funding. Maybe some people believe that it's private funding that's incentivized through tax credits. These are positions of two political parties in the country, right? At the end of the day, though, the goal is still the same. We believe that everyone should have access to this. How we get there might be different. And that debate is healthy and fine in a democracy. So we just need to sort of take a step back and figure out how we can both advocate for diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, advocate through it.
I think in the last few years especially, I could be wrong, but in the last few years from what I've seen, the arts have really been used as a tool to promote justice. We saw that after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of songs, a lot of murals to kind of fight against police brutality in this country.
That's exactly true. I mean, we have seen that, and that has also been the case through every social movement in history. Artists are at the center, whether it be the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, the resistance to the Vietnam War, the AIDS epidemic that was happening in the 80s. The arts were a part of it. But that's why we have to have these conversations about diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, because if young people never develop an artistic literacy, how are they ever going to tackle the issues they care about in that way? We had a very robust arts learning infrastructure that helped people, those artists at the center of the civil rights movement or the war resistance or the fight against AIDS, that were able to carry those messages forward in creative ways. By actually limiting arts learning for young people, by actually limiting access to artistic and cultural experiences in communities that always fall along economic and racial divides, we're literally removing the opportunity for those people to advocate for the changes they want to see in the world. The UN has actually cited the United States for the school-to-prison pipeline. We've made the case before that in doing so, they're actually removing artistic learning opportunities because the schools that are in youth prisons don't have the arts, to as a social justice issue, as a civil rights issue. Our own Secretary of Education said that the status of the arts in America's public schools is a civil rights issue because the disparity falls along racial lines. So we have to, in the arts, advocate for those changes first, because if we want to see those global changes towards a more just world, we have to tackle the access issue within our own sector, because it falls along those lines and it systematically denies the cultivation of those creative capabilities that allow for the social justice issues to be tackled through the arts. Now, I think we're going, in the right direction. I think those changes are there, as we've just talked about. But it is a responsibility and it's a consciousness that, arts managers, particularly those, y'all are in school right now, you have to learn that now so that in your career it can be part of the conversation. We've spent the last several years, like with the murder of George Floyd, of, waking up our consciousness as a sector, and that's not okay. We need to begin with that.
Absolutely. Well said. That was fantastic. Another kind of critical issue in the U.S. in particular, but also globally, is the issue of digital inequity. And I'm just kind of wondering how the arts maybe can play a role in promoting digital equity, whether that is access, literacy, or maybe kind of co-advocacy efforts.
I think there's a couple of key things here. So I'm going to parse that question into two. I think digital advocacy is something that has caught on, particularly with the pandemic. One little known fact that if you're sort of a Washington insider, you learn very early on when you start to have friends that work on Capitol Hill, is that our members of Congress, for example, they keep a list of key issues that they care about. And there's someone in the office who literally tracks the amount of phone calls and emails or social media posts that come to the member of Congress for or against a certain issue. And they deliver that report to the member at the end of the week. So say we got 300 phone calls in favor of Project X or 400 opposed to Project Y. And it helps them make an informed decision. And so the increase in digital engagement, just writ large, means that we need to have an increased digital footprint when it comes to advocacy, because there are people out there who are doing it. And if we don't do it also for issues in arts and culture, we're going to be left behind. So I think the increased literacy of digital engagement of just people in general is an asset and something that we need to harness in order to advocate for the arts. The second part of that, though, about digital or media or news literacy is absolutely essential. In fact, I was actually speaking at a conference, the NAMELY conference, the National Association for Media Literacy Education, back in 2015 or 16. And it was as the national core art standards were being released. And, I think everyone there was like, what are you doing? You're representing the arts. This is about media literacy education. Why are you even here? And it was because we were drawing a connection to the new art form that was written into these public policies, media arts. The idea of designing media through the lens of artistic literacy is absolutely essential. Young people are more news literate, more media literate, more digitally literate when they understand how to create it. They understand perspective and how facts can be manipulated. They understand presentation and how views can be changed with perspective. They understand that when they make something, they learn how to interpret something made by others in the same way. So in the way that we talk about the ability in visual art to read a painting, being visually literate, so if there's a gold halo, it goes back to, it's probably something that has to do with a deity, right? Godlike features. But it doesn't say that. There's no label that says God with an arrow, but there's a gold halo on someone. Apply that same logic to media arts and media literacy. All of a sudden, when you're creating digital media, you understand how to be literate in other people's digital media and how to discern what is true and what is not. So you can read through and make sense, make meaning out of the deluge of information coming at us every single day. So in a sort of post-truth world, or in a world where, facts aren't entirely facts all the time, we need to increase that. And we can actually do that as part of our arts learning opportunities for people. It can be part of the increase of awareness. In fact, one of the case studies that I did back in 2019 was on the Bangladesh Institute for Theater Arts that actually worked with some international development agencies to increase news literacy by literally playing theater games in villages all across Bangladesh. And it was such a cool project because what they were doing were teaching those skills to be able to tell what's fake news and what's not using theater. Who would have ever thought that like our State Department is putting money into theater in another country in order to do that? But you're right, we're in a globally connected world. We have to build those skills in order to have a more cohesive society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing that just came to my mind was STEAM education, which is STEM with the addition of the arts. And I think that's something that I've heard conversations here and there, and I've read, things here and there about it. But I still think it's kind of a, for lack of a better word, a niche thing in the arts advocacy realm. I don't know. What's your take on that?
Well, I have a lot of feelings about STEAM, especially a lot of my work in Washington was during sort of the height of the STEAM movement. And to be perfectly frank, I think STEAM was an advocacy tactic. I think it worked. I think there was a tremendous amount of money being put into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, when that term sort of came to be. And the STEM folks talked about how creativity and innovation were essential. But without an artistic or a creative process as part of that, think about the scientific method. When you get to the end of it, you have to change it up. You have to create something. You have to innovate. That was missing, right? That's missing in STEM. So you do need STEAM. You need the integration of the arts with that. Now, some of the research that I've actually done more recently, in fact, Creative Generation just completed a project with the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art and our friends over at Wolf Brown, another consulting firm. And we put forward a new model that we called an enriched understanding of arts integration. Now, arts integration is a pedagogical approach in creative learning that intertwines the arts with other academic subjects. How do you, third graders retain the names of planets better when they dance the solar system, right? Okay, really basic, that's sort of a silly example, but there's really strong ways, like we were talking about before, with President Obama witnessing the teaching of history through jazz and hip hop music. Now, we argue in this new body of work that there's sort of a new approach. Let's move away from those buzzwords of STEAM or what have you, and actually just talk about the role of the arts in education and human development, right? The arts can be part of teaching and learning, right? If you're not drawing what you see in the microscope, you're probably not having a very good science class. In the same way that if you're in a literature class, you should be acting out the Shakespeare play that you're reading, right? That increases our understanding and knowledge of those concepts. But this spectrum goes all the way to civic engagement and participation through literacy, like we were just talking about. So there's an element here about thinking of the role of the arts and culture and creativity in almost every element of the human experience. And that can be done very intentionally. When we think about the arts at the table in economic and community development, we think about the role of the arts and creativity in transportation. And it all sort of boils down to the idea that we're building creative capability in people in order to solve the challenges of the future that we can't even imagine today.
To that note, I feel like a lot of other issues that we're facing right now, like climate change, gun violence, healthcare, all these like really major issues, of course, tend to overshadow the arts because the arts just seem like this little teeny thing that is considered a luxury and is not considered like an essential. Not all the time, of course. We talked about this a little bit already, but is there anything more you'd like to add to how the arts are kind of a part of everything that we as humans need to advocate for?
Yeah, I think there's two elements to this. Direct role and provision for the arts or culture in those different elements. So in healthcare, we know that arts therapies, dance therapy, music therapy, visual art therapy, and more are part of it. You know, there's tremendous studies about soldiers overcoming PTSD through visual art and things of that nature. We also know that in transportation, right, like there's really great solutions to beautifying and creating transportation infrastructure that people want to engage in, right, in subway systems and things like that. And we've already talked about the role of, tackling issues of gun violence through advocacy in arts and culture. Now, there's part of the art that is a piece of that solution when applied that matches some of those sort of high art forms. I just did air quotes around that. Dance, music, theater, visual art, so forth. But there's another element of having artists or people with creative capacity to solve those problems. We've been doing transportation the same way in this country for a really long time. What if we put a bunch of creatives at the table to think differently about how we might tackle an issue of city congestion? And I'll give you an example. They did this in New York City. They realized that humans were running into each other a lot in Times Square. So they redesigned Times Square. After some observations with some theater makers, they were able to see that people, when crossing Grand Central Station, which has a central ticket booth, were able to navigate, not run into each other. Therefore, they weren't mad at each other because they were able to pass by and not have any conflict. These are observations from theater makers. Think about that theater game, when you walk through the space and you have to navigate and interact with people. When you bump into people, you get mad and people get angry. But have a central point that you're avoiding, like at Grand Central, you are mad at an inanimate object and not at people. It was theater makers that were able to observe this. And when they reconstructed Times Square, if you visit New York City today, there's a bunch of just things in the way. So people have to bob and weave through, applying that theater game in order to overcome the challenge. Now, if someone said, okay, here's a couple $1 million to redesign Times Square, would you ever say, okay, hire a bunch of theater makers? No, you wouldn't. You would pick an urban designer, you do whatever. Well, the beauty of it is when we apply that creativity, when we apply those creative skills that are harnessed through the learning in the arts, we're able to come up with totally new solutions that we would have never envisioned before. So I think, yes, we absolutely need to use artistic practice as part of the solution in healthcare and school reform and, name your big sector of society. But we also just need to both integrate artists and creatives, but also just build arts and creative skills in everyone so that you have lawyers and accountants and urban designers that have those creative capabilities already, that they understand each other and diverse cultures, that they're able to communicate in new and different ways. And in my opinion, that's a way that we achieve a more inclusive and a more just society.
There's so many more questions I want to ask you, but we are short on time. So I'll just kind of end with this. Is there anything that maybe we didn't touch on that you wanted to bring up, or are there any resources that you'd want to share with?
Sure. There's a tremendous amount of research that's been there, and I think we can, compile a number of the studies and things that we've talked about today. I'll do a shameless plug. At Creative Generation, we just released a new resource called Case Making and Systems Change in Arts and Cultural Education, which you can view online at www.creative-generation.org/casemaking.
Fantastic. So we'll post links to those in the transcript of this podcast. Jeff, thank you so much for being here and for talking about such an important topic. Thank you for listening to Tech in the Arts. Be on the lookout for new episodes coming to you very soon. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, be sure to send it to another arts or technology aficionado in your life. You can let us know what you think of this podcast by visiting our website, amtlab.org. That's amt-lab.org, or you can email us at amtlabcmu@gmail.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Tech in the Arts, or Facebook and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. We'll see you for the next episode.